Right, I think we're going to make a start and let the rest trickle in as we get going. So first off, thank you everyone for your patience, for those of you that have returned who came to the first scheduling of this event, and welcome to everyone else. My name's Clara. I'm the current president here at Oxford Psychedelic Society. And as you all know, today we've got with us Dr. Peter Sjöstedt-Hughes. I hope I said that okay, Peter. Amazing. So Peter is a philosopher of mind and ontologist, and those of you that know your philosophy or know any of Peter's work will know about his work on panpsychism. I admit I only came across Peter's work more recently while talking to a friend and found it absolutely fascinating and super accessible, and have been very excited to have you come and talk to us ever since, Peter. So Peter is also an author and has given an incredible TED talk called Psychedelics and Consciousness, which if you haven't seen, go onto YouTube after this talk and have a look. It's really good. And he's here to talk to us today about Spinoza. And before I pass over to you, Peter, I've got two things to say. One of them is, if you have a question while Peter's talking, feel free just to pop it in the chat of the Zoom call, or if you're currently watching off the YouTube stream, hello, put a question just in the chat over there, and we will read them out at the end. If you're on the Zoom call, we'll unmute you and you can ask your question directly. The second thing to say is that we really pride ourselves on running all our talks for free at Oxford Psychedelic Society, but it's not free for us to run them. So if you could donate anything our way, someone's about to put a link to our PayPal in the chat. £1, £2, £5, whatever it is, we honestly appreciate anything you can give us. And that's all from me. So thank you very much for coming, and Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Clara. First of all, I'd like to thank you and the other organisers and of the Oxford University Psychedelic Society. It's an honour to be here. I apologise to those who were here last week with my internet, but today it seems okay, no storm or anything like that. So I'll be talking for about 45 minutes, I guess, and I'm happy to take questions. I'm going to cover a lot of ground, so there probably will be a number of questions. I always prefer questions anyway to talk, so please feel free to ask. Anyway, so my talk is, I think, entitled Spinozism and Psychedelics, Ecology and Eternity. I'm currently writing about this element of Spinoza for a book on philosophy and psychedelics to be published by Bloomsbury, which is sort of part of a psychedelic research hub that's being created at the University of Exeter, where I'm based in the UK. Anyway, okay, so let's begin. So first of all, I'm going to give you the argument, and then I'm going to give you the sort of general plan, and then I'm going to go through it, and then conclusion, and then we'll have Q&A. Okay, so this is the argument. Today's prevailing Western ideology of what I call panpsychism, which I will explain later as sort of form of physicalism, has led to the mind-matter explanatory gap, the ecological crisis, and the default judgment that unitive psychedelic experiences are non-veridical, in other words, hallucinatory or delusory. Panpsychism, or materialism, physicalism, blah, blah, mechanism, is a legacy, I shall argue, of the Cartesian bifurcation, division of mind and matter. Thirdly, the Cartesian bifurcation carried on through history partly because its rectification by Spinoza, the great philosopher, was reprimanded and suppressed. Primarily via church power. And in fact, I'll argue that it was actually church power, therefore, that led in part to the modern scientific framework, ironically. Then Spinozism, I shall argue, could judge unitive psychedelic experiences as veridical, in other words, objectively true, especially when one considers its notion of the intellectual love of God, or the amor Dei intellectualis, which has a number of affinities therewith. And then I will talk about briefly one specific psychedelic, 5-MeO-DMT, which I shall sort of compare very briefly compare the phenomenology of that to Spinoza's intellectual love of God. Moreover, I'll argue that this form of experience is a kind of direct intuition of Spinoza's whole metaphysical system. So therefore, the Spinozan system and the psychedelic experience are in a sort of symbiotic relationship. They can substantiate each other. Furthermore, then, Spinozism, I will say, alleviates the explanatory gap, to some extent mitigates the ecological crisis. The founder of deep ecology, the Norwegian philosopher Arne Næss, he explicitly endorses Spinozism as a solution to the ecological crisis. So I'll be speaking about that as well, all briefly in 45 minutes, obviously. So therefore, in conclusion, I'll say that the unity of psychedelic state and the Spinozan system symbiotically advance each other as a modern antidote to our cognitive cul-de-sac and to our looming planetary catastrophe. Well, that's the basic argument. Well, not that basic, so a lot in there, but I will proceed in this manner. I'll first of all talk about the West's tragic polarities, so Descartes and Spinoza, mind and matter, religion, science, pantheism, panpsychism, mankind and nature. I'll say that these polarities, these divisions are, predominantly a legacy of Descartes' thought rather than Spinoza's. And I'll argue why that's wrong, why Descartes was wrong, and why Spinoza has a more parsimonious answer to these things. Then, of course, second part, I'll speak about what Spinozism is. I'm assuming now, as this is not a philosophy conference, a number of you perhaps have never heard of Spinozism or Spinoza. So I'll just go through that, in about 5 minutes, which is going to be a bit challenging. And then thirdly, I'll specifically hone in on 5-MeO-DMT and the intellectual love of God, and then conclude. So let us begin. So first of all, then, I'll talk about the West's tragic polarities, as I call it. But first of all, psychedelic experience. So when one talks about psychedelic experience, of course, it's a vast range of experiences. There's no such thing as the psychedelic experience. But of course, over time, one sort of notices certain types of experience which recur. William James, everyone speaks about William James, but so I'll mention him one more time. In 1902, identified psychedelic experience as congruent with traditional mysticism, and identified the mystical state under 4 criteria. Those were passivity, that one is not in control of the situation. One is passive. Transience, that the experience passes in normal time quickly. Noumenautics, the sense of the reality, of the revelation of the experience, that there's something true to hold. And ineffability, in this sense, it means that this experience cannot be put into words. By the way, I classify psychedelic mystical states, I classify as a subset of psychedelic states. So there are many other types of psychedelic states and completely unrelated to mysticism, but one type certainly is very much related, I would say. Bertrand Russell, the great British philosopher, in 1914, he in this great book called Mysticism and Logical Essay, he identifies 4 other overlapping criteria. Those are the sense of revelation, Noetism, the unreality of good and evil, and I will mention this in relation to Spinozism later, the unreality of time, and of unity. And of unity, Russell means, quote, pantheism in religion and monism in philosophy. But most of these psychedelic states can only be interpreted as hallucination or delusion according to our common default Western mindset, or at best as mystery. Of course, people, when one is brought up, I was brought up in England and partly in Sweden, one is not told this is the truth and this is the way to think about things, but implicitly this ideology is conveyed to one. And this means that, well, very much in England and Sweden, actually more so than other countries perhaps, one has, with this basic ideology, one has a standard by which one can judge things to be true or not, or delusory or not. What is this mindset then? So it's variously known as mechanism, materialism, physicalism. Some people differentiate that. Panpsychism is a word I like because some people talk, like Galen Strawson calls and Karl Popper call panpsychism a physicalism, which complicates matters. So panpsychism, heil meaning is what Aristotle used to mean sort of, well, it comes from the Greek word wood, but it just means dead matter. This was coined by a guy called Joseph Raphson, 17th century. He actually coined it when at the same time as coining pantheism. It wasn't John Toland, as some people say. But anyway, this is an ideology. It's a faith position, not based on experience and reason. It's not a neutral. It's not a neutral state. It's not a lack of belief. It is a belief. It's the view that all phenomena, notably mentality, can be reduced to predominantly spatially quantifiable elements. And this ideology came to dominate or hijack what is now known as science. Not the great German word Wissenschaft, which is much broader, but in English, science is more narrow. And although it's science, of course, is a method, it does have an ideology tagging along with it, as it were. Philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn, who coined paradigm shift, he writes this in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He writes, quote, "Normal science is an attempt to force nature into the preformed and relatively inflexible box that the paradigm supplies." After Descartes' immensely influential scientific writings, most physical scientists assumed that the universe was composed of microscopic corpuscles, atoms, and that all natural phenomena could be explained in terms of corpuscular shape, size, motion, and interaction. Now, of course, anyone who knows their history realizes that this ideology has progenitors, famously Leucippus, Democritus, Epicurus, Lucretius, and others. But in the modern world, I shall argue, and is argued by others, it was crystallized by Descartes. René Descartes lived 1596 to 1650, died in Stockholm. And then I had a little push, of course, from Galileo, Bacon, Hobbes, and others, later Hobbes. I will go into that a little bit more in detail in a moment in relation to this, but I'll say for now that this arid, reductive Cartesian mindset was neutralized by Spinoza, who was born less than 40 years after Descartes. He was born in 1632. So opposed to Descartes' dualism, Descartes is probably mostly famous for his dualism, that mind and matter are separate substances. Spinoza then offers a monism, that there's only one substance, and mind and matter are attributes thereof. For Descartes' dualism then, in Descartes, pretty extreme, only humans had mind. He makes one omission for magpies, is inconsistent, but all other animals and creatures had no sentience whatsoever. Only humans had a soul, and that would, live on in the afterlife and so on. So that was quite compatible with his Catholicism. There was thought then, or mind or soul, and then the other substance was extension. Matter is pure extension, like space. And this space then had no soul, no mind whatsoever. It was dead matter. It had no sentience, it had no intrinsic worth, it had no intrinsic value, in other words. But Spinoza, offering this solution to this, the problem with dualism is that there was always a problem of interaction. Descartes never really satisfactorily answered how these two completely different substances could interact. He said they did in the pineal gland in the brain, but no one really bought it, and he himself didn't really buy it, if you look into the literature. Spinoza did solve it in his way, his monistic way, but he was then heavily reprimanded and suppressed, as we'll see, primarily through church influence. So interestingly, it was Christianity, I shall argue, that helped shape the barren form of modern science. Even though he was a dualist then, his notion of nature, or of dead matter, came to dominate then our general scientific outlook. Why was Spinoza not taken seriously after his death? And well, I'll go into his history in a little bit, but basically he was branded an atheist when atheism was an especially bad thing, 17th century and thereafter. This wasn't only due to his monism, his panpsychism, but also due to his pantheism, that God was nature, or nature was God. This, of course, a lot of people said, well, if you're going to call God nature, then you're really saying God doesn't exist. That's not quite true, as I shall show later, but that's the accusation against him. It was also due to, he wrote this great book, Theological Political Treatise, where he criticizes our understanding of the Bible, and says, like, the first 5 books of the Bible weren't written by Moses, they were written by various authors and so on, and miracles are not, didn't actually happen, and so on and so forth. Didn't go down well with the church, let's say. He also has relatively liberal political views, right to religion, right, freedom of expression. He also, because of he believed that good and evil were not real, they were just our way of seeing the world. And of course, he was Jewish, and there might have been sort of hidden anti-Semitism against him as well. Calvinist and scholar Pierre Bayle called Spinozism in 1697, quote, the most monstrous hypothesis, diametrically opposed to the ideas most evident to the mind. And this opposition, this hatred in a way, culminated in the so-called pantheism controversy of the 1780s. Very basically, that's where Jacobi purported Lessing to be a Spinozist, which the latter's friend Mendelssohn reproached, and then the whole European intellectual world got involved. And really this pantheism controversy marks the end of the Enlightenment. And I'll say again that the word pantheism was coined by Joseph Raphson in relation to Spinozism. So originally when you called yourself a pantheist, you meant a Spinozist. So the pantheism controversy marked the end of the Enlightenment, brought in Romanticism, idealism, and so on at the beginning of the 1800s. But what Jacobi did, who was an anti-Spinozist, what he actually brought in was a lot of interest in Spinoza amongst philosophers and poets and intellectuals generally. There was this growing appreciation of Spinozism thereafter then, but Cartesianism had already taken hold of the West, its religion and science, and thus its general outlook, its general worldview. So the Cartesian bifurcation, Cartesian, Descartes in Latin's Cartesius. So the Cartesian separation of mind and matter led to this focused division then of religion as well, another bifurcation, religion for mind or soul, and for science just for matter, with separate fields with a separate substance to look upon. Science came to reject the very existence of mind as equally fundamental to matter. So for Spinoza, as we shall see, mind and matter are equal in terms of their fundamentality. When you look at, if you just think of reality as matter only or extension only, you lose that notion of mind as equally fundamental. So what seems to have happened is science took on Descartes' view of nature, but they just left the soul away. They left that to religion, and said it wasn't scientific, it wasn't something we should look at. Both religion and science then saw nature as a machine and God as its transcendent creator. It's further emphasized by Thomas Hobbes with French backing, Mersenne, Gassendi, Descartes, then later by Delametre, who wrote a book called Man and Machine, 1747, Newton arguably later. Hobbes reduced the mind to the physicalist body. Now, just interestingly, a number of Spinozists, they said that this is what Spinoza did, and there are a number of interpretations of Spinoza, but that's basically a wrong interpretation. So Hobbes reduced the mind to the physicalist body. This is sort of pure materialism, really, but he kept the dualism of God and the universe. Eventually, though, even God was reduced to mind as an illusion of the mind, and as mind was reduced to mindless matter, only the machine was left. The universe as a machine obeying rules is a legacy of Descartes' thought, 17th century thought. So this mechanist ideology, this panpsychism, everything is matter, in other words, and the Industrial Revolution influenced each other and led to the culture we now find ourselves in. In 1886, Nietzsche, the great German philosopher Nietzsche, wrote, quote, physics is only a way of interpreting the world or arranging the world, and not a way of explaining the world. But it may be exactly right for a hardy, industrious future race of machinists and bridge builders who have only dirty work to do. So Nietzsche himself was identifying this panpsychism as an ideology, and also said it was apt for the age and linked it then to the Industrial Revolution. And this, of course, leads to our ecological crisis, as I'll get to in a moment. But first I'll say this, current science cannot explain mind. There's then the so-called explanatory gap, Levine, 1983. There's the more famous hard problem of consciousness, which David Chalmers coined in 1995. A lot of people in the philosophy of mind or in cognitive science or in psychology will say, no, this is not a problem. We do understand the mind, but no one agrees. So it's still a very open question. It's like the biggest mystery of the age. And many people see the hard problem of consciousness as falsification of physicalism. And I could speak about that in the Q&A happily. But current science then cannot explain mind. It's reached a cul-de-sac, a dead end. And current religion cannot explain nature, evolution, cosmos, problem of evil, and so on and so forth. Now, both of these problems then are due to bifurcation that was triggered by Descartes. So when looking at psychedelic phenomenology, psychedelic experience, science can't accept any veridicality, any truth claims for the deep psychedelic unitive states at least. It can only trace physical correlates, notably neural correlates of consciousness, and assume, and this is where philosophy of mind comes in, and I'll happily talk about this later, an emergentism of these phenomena, because it assumes that matter must be at the most fundamental level. Therefore, it assumes that mind must emerge from that. There are other beliefs as well, of course, psychoneural identity theory I can speak about, but emergentism, Jae-Won Kim, the great philosopher of mind, said is the sort of the general view of the mind today. And it was 100 years ago as well. There was a group of philosophers called the British Emergentists, which started with Mill, ended with Broad. Anyway, that's a footnote. But anyway, so when looking from our modern worldview, when looking at unitive psychedelic experiences, we can only see them as delusory. The problem is with emergentism that there are actually no scientific laws which explain that emergence, how an emotion can emerge from emotion in the brain or wherever. Alternatively, there are no laws that identify mental states to neural states alone. Psychoneural identity theory, bigger in the 20th century. In certain extreme cases, more common in the 20th century, it was even denied that mind exists completely. There's absolutely no consciousness whatsoever. For example, the schools of thought such as eliminativism, logical behaviorism, some forms of psychoneural identity theory, like I said, and others. There's a position the philosopher Galen Strawson calls the great silliness. This is, to deny consciousness is the silliest possible state. But this is a quite common state. Mental fictionalism, illusionism are other examples, really. But why would people reach this absurd, silly view? Well, the reason is I argue, a legacy of this Cartesian bifurcation that was not remedied through Spinoza, unfortunately. These paradoxes and anomalies that we find in philosophy of mind now indicate errors of the initial assumptions and beliefs. Moreover, and that's just this philosophy of mind, the academic stuff. I mean, moreover, the real danger of this view of nature as dead is its effect upon the planet, the health of the planet, in terms of the ecological crisis. If you see nature as purely dead, as purely physical, without any intrinsic value, then of course it's much easier to exploit it. This danger was flagged by Alfred North Whitehead, great philosopher, died in 1947. It was later flagged by Lynn White, Arne Næss, whom I mentioned, Carolyn Merchant in her book, The Death of Nature, 1980. Lynn White, in his influential 1967 text called The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, pins the blame on science as a legacy of dualistic Christianity for the crisis. He especially laments the replacement of pagan animism, panpsychism, by Christian dualism. And so in this framework, you can see Descartes as a solidifier of the general Christian view. Now, of course, there are many refutations of Lynn White from Christian theology, but that's something we can discuss later. So opposed to this pan-hylism of science, we have the deep ecology movement. One of the main founder of that was then Arne Næss, and he writes this: the nature, quote, the nature conceived by field ecologists is not the passive, dead, value-neutral nature of mechanistic science, but akin to the Deus sive natura, God or nature, of Spinoza, all-inclusive, creative, infinitely diverse, and alive in the broad sense of panpsychism. Panpsychism, by the way, is the view that there is psyche, or sentience, really, in everything, and not just in animals or humans, as Descartes thought. So thinking of nature as merely mechanical without any immanent sentience then or value modifies our respect and treatment of nature. As Næss was keen to point out, we have to change our fundamental, our deep, that's the word, deep ecology. We have to change our deep understanding of nature if we are to mitigate the damage that the Industrial Revolution has inflicted upon the world. And for Ness, then, Spinoza was a solution. Quote from 1977, no great philosopher has so much to offer in the way of clarification and articulation of basic ecological attitudes as Baruch Spinoza. Unfortunately, then, it's not pantheism, but panpsychism. And that's another important dichotomy that's become default Western ideology to the detriment of the planet. Carolyn Merchant, who wrote this book that I mentioned, The Death of Nature, writes this, quote, the mechanical view of nature, now taught in most Western schools, is accepted without question as our everyday common sense reality. So it's looking at history, it's important to realize, some of the factors, not the only factor, but a fundamental factor of our ecological crisis and the way we look at psychedelics today has a common root. The hard problem of consciousness and the ecological crisis are both the products of the Cartesian bifurcation of mind and matter, mankind and nature. The Cartesian bifurcation, however, is resolved through Spinozism, from dualism to monism, which I shall explain in a moment. And then unitive psychedelic states can be understood through Spinozism and in turn reinforce Spinozism. So through this Spinozist path, then, psychedelics, I shall say, can be seen as a catalyst for advancing deep ecological reevaluation. Okay, so what is Spinozism? How am I doing for time? Okay. Spinoza, let's talk about Spinoza first. Baruch Spinoza, and then he came to call himself Benedict Spinoza later. He was born 1632, died in 1677. He lived in Amsterdam. He was a Dutch Sephardim Jew. The Sephardim Jews, very interesting history in themselves. They came from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, Portugal. They were forced there in the 15th century to convert either to Catholicism or to leave. Some of them left, some of them converted, but then those who converted were suspected of being secret Jews, and thus the Spanish Inquisition was born for that reason. So Spinoza's family were part of that Iberian Jewish sect who set up in Amsterdam, very liberal place at the time, and still is, of course. He was part of the community there in Amsterdam in the 1600s, but unfortunately, at the age of 24, he was excommunicated by his Jewish community for holding quite, at the time, radical views. Someone even tried to assassinate him. He lived by grinding lenses, probably lived by grinding lenses. He was offered a job at Heidelberg University as a professor of philosophy, but he declined, saying that I don't know how to teach philosophy without being a disturber of the peace. So he already knew in his lifetime that what he was saying was dangerous. And this is why he published his theological treatise anonymously, and why his major work, The Ethics, was published posthumously. So those are his two major works, probably, I should say. In 1697, then, 20 years after he died, pantheism was coined to refer to his philosophy. And then, like I said, the pantheism controversy erupted. Then people became very interested in his work, notably Novalis, Goethe, Hegel, Schopenhauer. In Britain, I should say, Humphrey Davy, the great chemical philosopher. I'm writing an essay with Professor David Nutt at the moment on, sort of based on Humphrey Davy. He wrote a poem called The Spinozist. He was friends with Coleridge and Wordsworth, who were also very sympathetic to Spinoza. The Davy link is especially interesting. I'll just quickly say as a footnote here, because so I live here in Western Cornwall, and in my local town, Penzance, there's a statue of Humphrey Davy, and I always thought that he was just a chemist, and invented some mining safety lamp. But actually, he was the first scientific psychonaut. Definitely, I've argued an essay in my forthcoming book of essays, but because he actually tried 200 pints of nitrous oxide in 1799 on Boxing Day in a sort of man-sized tank, and got out of it saying that he thought all of reality was made of thoughts. That's another talk, I've given. But anyway, just to say that, yeah, he and his poet friends were very much grateful to Spinoza's kind of emancipating thought. But they didn't influence, unfortunately, these lake poets, they did not influence science and philosophy so much. So in the 20th century, we had positivism come in, which spurned metaphysics generally. Alfred North Whitehead stood out there as a neo-Spinozist, T.L.S. Sprigg and some others. But the 20th century, unfortunately, was very reductive in terms of mind. This is actually another footnote of interest. When the psychedelics became popular in the West in the 1960s, this was at the peak reductive stage of sort of Western cognitive culture, unfortunately. So it was sort of ignored then, pretty much. There are exceptions. But Spinoza also influenced Nietzsche to some extent. Nietzsche said, I found my forefather, as it were, to start with at least. Einstein was a huge Spinozist, wrote a number of things about him. Bourges, Deleuze wrote 2 books about Spinoza, Arnonnes, as I mentioned. So he had a big influence amongst intellectuals, but Spinozism didn't have hardly any influence really on general culture and science. What is Spinozism then? So this will be very brief, but it's essentially this then. So there are not 2 substances, mind, matter, or 3 with God as a separate substance. There's one substance, meaning the fundamental thing of reality that doesn't undergo change. There's one substance, and he calls that God, but he also calls that nature, and that's what got him into a lot of trouble. And that's why he was called a pantheism afterwards. That one substance, God, nature, all synonyms, has an infinity of attributes. Key term for him, attributes. Now, extension and thought, or broadly speaking, matter and mind, are 2 of God's nature's attributes. They're the only 2 that humans have access to. These attributes then are expressions of God nature. They're not separate from him. They're just ways of looking at him. They're abstractions. There are limited expression of God nature. And then within those, I should also say that there's an infinity of attributes. So we know 2, but there's an infinity of others. And this is because God nature is perfect. And then, so there's substances, attributes, and then there's modes. And modes are just particular instances of extension of thought, the attributes. So a particular thought is a mode, a particular physical thing at a certain time is a mode, and so on and so forth. So interestingly then, mind and matter are not 2 separate things that interact. There is no interaction. They're both then expressions of the same thing. They're the same thing. God, when we look at extension of space, we're looking at God nature in one way, and when we think of our minds, we're looking at it in another way, but they're essentially the same thing. They don't interact, so there's no interaction problem as Descartes had. They're abstractions, as I said. When I said we can perceive 2, for extension, we can only perceive 3-dimensional extension as well, 3D space. Certain physicists say there's more than 3 dimensions. There was a great mathematician of the 4th dimension, 4th spatial dimension, not time, called Charles Hinton, who wrote about Spinoza in relation to n-dimensional space. But anyway, we perceive 2, there's an infinity of them. This is, it's rather complicated when you read it, but this is one way of overcoming then Cartesian dualism and interaction problems. There's no reduction of the mental to the physical, as in physicalism, panpsychism. They're equally fundamental then, because mind and matter are both expressions of the same thing. It's not that matter is more fundamental than mind, or mind more fundamental than matter, as you'd get in idealism. Equally fundamental. Unfortunately, though, a number of interpreters see Spinoza as a physicalist still today, strangely, although that's obviously mistaken. Einstein wrote this, quote, "Spinoza is the greatest of modern philosophers because he's the first philosopher who deals with the soul and the body as one, not as 2 separate things." So getting into philosophy of mind a little bit now, what I quite like. There's no mental to physical causation, downward causation as it's known, mental causation. There's no physical to mental causation or upward causation, emergence then, because then there are not 2 things. We're not talking about 2 separate things. not even two properties at different levels in the hierarchy. And these two, the upward causation and downward causation, in other words, emergence and mental causation, are the two of the greatest contemporary challenges in the philosophy of mind. There's only then mind-matter to mind-matter causation. So there still is mental causation in a way, but you have to understand that the mental and the material are both the same thing. So there is still causation as such. So it's not a denial of mental causation, though it does deny free will, which is separate therefrom. So yeah, you can call it then a pan. So everything that is extended is just one expression of God, nature. It means that all of space is also mind. There's mind parallel to all of matter, and that is known today as panpsychism. Well, that was actually coined by Patrizzi, who was a philosopher who lived before Spinoza, but nonetheless, it's becoming popular again now among people like Thomas Nagel, Galen Strauss, and so on. Spinoza was one of the main panpsychists. He's also a pantheist because he says that everything is God. And there's an interesting question whether panpsychism must lead to pantheism. Anyway, so those substance, attribute, and mode do away then with a lot of these causal problems in the philosophy of mind and interaction and so on and so forth. Another important aspect of Spinozism is that he said every individual had a conatus, a sort of will to power, as Nietzsche would call it, to preserve oneself and also to better oneself, he says in a short treatise. He was also a fatalist. He didn't believe in free will. He believed that everything was absolutely necessary. Now, not in a physicalist determinist sense, of course, but ultimately because of the fixed laws of nature and because God, substance nature, in its essence was eternal. And I'll get into this a little bit more quick in a moment, but eternal means outside of time, not infinite within time. We only see nature God then as extended and as mental, but this, of course, is just abstraction, that we're not seeing God as he really is, nature as it really is. Duration, he writes as well, it's only a human way of perceiving extension and thought, but in absolute reality then, independent of human minds, nature God is eternal, timeless, outside of time. What is eternity? Okay, I'm running out of time, but quickly. Eternity, briefly, is one can understand by thinking about time. What is time? Well, the philosopher McTaggart said that the essence of time is to differentiate the past, the present, and future. We can talk about time in terms of the specious present. How long is the present? It can be extended and made shorter. We can talk about the speed of time. Bergson calls it a rhythm of duration. So sometimes when you're in danger, time slows down. This happened to my brother recently when he almost had a bicycle accident. He was sort of in slow motion, it seemed. But note that all of these essential aspects of time are subjective. In other words, they are mind dependent. Eternity then is mind independent. It's reality outside of human minds. Boethius, the philosopher in the 6th century, wrote this: the eternal, quote, the eternal embraces the whole of time in one simultaneous present. Einstein famously wrote that we physicists don't believe in time and duration. And that's a whole other talk. But as regards our talk, I will ask the question, is this eternity experiential? Frederick Pollock, a great Spinozan commentator, writes this, quote, Spinoza's doctrine of the eternity of the mind must remain one of the most brilliant endeavors of speculative philosophy. So Spinoza argues that eternity is experiential, but it's rare. And he does this mostly through his notion in the last part of his book, The Ethics, in book 5 of the Ethics, in his notion that he calls the intellectual love of God. Now, first of all, I should just preface this by saying that every single commentator who writes about the intellectual love of God has got a very different interpretation of what it means. So I'm giving you one interpretation, which perhaps is quite radical, but nonetheless, I've got backup references. So there's many interpretations, as I say, but let's consider this. With one of the reasons people didn't like Spinoza's philosophy was that it didn't, if mind and body are the same thing, it does not allow for the mind to exist after death. There is no duration, there's no soul that lives on after the death of the body. There's no personal afterlife, no personal pre-life either. There's no heaven, no hell below us, above us only sky. And this is reprimanded by the church. However, he writes this in Proposition 23 of the fifth book of the Ethics, and this has stumped a lot of commentators. Because a lot of people like Spinozism up till now. It's like, yes, mind, body, exactly the same thing. It's pretty rational, parsimonious and so on. But then he throws this in. He writes, quote, Spinoza writes, the human mind cannot be absolutely destroyed along with the body, but something of it remains, which is eternal. Frederick Pollock, the commentator, writes that, quote, Spinoza's eternal life is not a continuance of existence, but a manner of existence. Now, Spinoza writes that the intellectual love of God is gained through a third type of knowledge. There are three types of knowledge for him. There's firstly common opinion or imagination, sort of sensibility. Secondly, it's reason and science. But there's a third type of knowledge, a rare third kind of knowledge he calls intuition. And he says, this intuition, quote, is the greatest striving of the mind and the greatest virtue. It's the ultimate aim of human life in a way. It's the highest blessedness. And he writes this, the third kind of knowledge proceeds from an adequate idea of certain attributes of God to an adequate knowledge of the essence of things. In other words, through this third kind of knowledge, we sort of pierce through those attributes and we gain exposure to the fundamental nature of reality in itself. He writes, the intellectual love of God, which arises from a third kind of knowledge, is eternal. Now, how is this possible, really? How does one gain knowledge? How does one gain immortality through eternity if there's no soul surviving after death? Well, he writes this, that, well, quote, the mind's intellectual love of God is the very love of God by which God loves himself, i.e. the mind's intellectual love of God is part of the infinite love by which God loves himself. In other words, in the intellectual love of God, your mind, body become God, God becomes you. God is eternal, timeless, therefore you become eternal temporarily, which is not a paradox. Human mind then becomes eternal, gains immortality when it steps outside time to unite with nature and God. And Spinoza writes, and this love or blessedness is called glory in the sacred scriptures. So although Spinoza was not a Christian, Jewish, he wasn't really religious in the traditional sense at all, nonetheless, he refers to this word glory in the Bible. In Hebrew, that's gloria in Latin, and it's kavod in Hebrew. Now, a lot of commentators don't talk about this allusion to glory, but it's there. It relates to another Jewish philosopher, theologian called Maimonides, who also wrote about glory, and he wrote about eternal life when the intellect becomes one, fuses with this infinite intellect. So in the short treatise, Spinoza writes that there are two dualisms, or two identities, two monisms. There's the mind with the body, but the mind can also be one with the totality of God when it gains the concrete essence of God itself. This ultimately comes from Aristotle, from his book on the soul, De Anima, book 3, chapter 5. I won't quote it to you, but Aristotle writes that we can temporarily become one with the eternal, and that's our immortality. So it's a form of immortality that's different from dualistic immortality. This Aristotelian tract had a troublesome legacy through Christian theology and Jewish Islamic theology down the years, because it seemed to advocate a non-personal, non-dualistic immortality, not related to heaven and hell, not related to one's behavior in this life at all. And so you can see Spinoza's love of God as a sort of legacy of that medieval conversation. But, and there's more to say about Maimonides' influence here and Aristotle's influence, but I'm running out of time, so I won't talk about that now, but I can talk about it in the Q&A if you want. But now I should say this. Spinoza's book, The Ethics, is called The Ethics because the ethics is about gaining an ethos that is peace of mind. And basically the book teaches you how to become cool, how to disassociate from how to not suffer from your emotions and so on. Now, this final bit about the immortality of the mind is to mitigate the fear of death. He argues that when you've achieved this immortality, death is, the fear of death is gone because one realizes that one will become one with timelessness. So if Spinozism is true, and that's another question altogether, then the unitive, timeless, commonly reported experience of unity in psychedelic and mystical states needs not be hallucination, but can be veridical, because this eternal reality does exist in this metaphysic. Maimonides writes that, quote, "This eternal state is the point of all religious practices." Spinoza says the highest good is the knowledge of the union that the mind has with the whole of nature. It's from the emendation of the intellect. But he also warns that this union is difficult and rare. Now, okay, so Spinoza doesn't talk about how to gain this experience of eternity, this intellectual love of God. But when you look at its legacy in Maimonides and so on, you see then that they do prescribe certain religious rituals such as repetition, prayer, fasting, things like this. Now, when I was looking into the unitive, reports of the unitive experience in psychedelics, one particular substance seemed to stick out, and that was then 5-MeO-DMT. This molecule is derived from the back of the Sonoran desert toad, Bufo alvarius, and there's a synthetic version that exists, and well, it does induce excessive states. You can't even say of consciousness, excessive states of being, and I'll just mention a few of those, as much as is possible for me, to try to express that state and then relate it to Spinozism. So notably then, there's a sense of extreme profundity, extreme importance, but there exists no object, no finite object to which this has an intentional relation. It's only profundity in terms of the state itself. It's not conceptualized, perhaps it's not even an experience. It's rather another state of being. It's interesting generally in philosophy of mind to experience this, because a number of philosophers say that all consciousness, all experience needs an object. You have to be conscious of something. But it seems that this is an excessively vivid state of consciousness, which is not conscious of any particular thing at all. There's no intentionality there, as philosophers will say. All sensations and thoughts are replaced by an all-encompassing white light. Note as well that kavod, the Hebrew word for glory, also means brilliant, radiant light, interestingly. There's a brief transition phase, as one can smoke it as a vapor, where thought snaps a realization of losing total control, it's very passive, and entering a new phase. This can be extremely traumatic. It can be very welcomed as well. There's sometimes a thought that maybe this is it, maybe you're dying, which is obviously traumatic to start with. But then there's very quick transition phase, and then there's this immediate loss of duration. In other words, the experienced flow of time. We thus transcend the normal human way of perceiving reality. We lose affectations, we lose emotions, we lose bodily senses, concepts, memories, the self, the sense of time and space are lost. But it's not a blackout, it's not loss of consciousness, it's quite the opposite. It's an extreme somethingness. But it's excessively something, it's ultra transcendence, it's extreme immersion into nothingness, but it's beyond the sublime. It's unitive. In that, there are no longer divisions between mind and matter, thought and extension, mind and nature, subject and object, self and world, past and future. There's no divisive psychological conflict. There's only an indivisible, immutable, unchanging, eternal, timeless superstate, thus comparable Spinoza's notion of substance as God nature. There's more to be said much more to be said about that, but I'm running out of time, as it were. So I'll just say what happened after. What can happen after. After a few days after my personal experience of this, I briefly felt a new fear, the fear of imprisonment within duration. But for many, there's a loss of the fear of death. And this, of course, links then back to the Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece and so on. The 5-MeO DMT state fulfills William James' 4 criteria. It fulfills Bertrand Russell's most of his criteria. There's a sense of revelation. There's the unreality of time. There's a sense of unity. But the 4th criterion of Russell, the unreality of good and evil, is not directly sensed. But of course, that unreality of good and evil does cohere with Spinozism in general. Octavio Paz, the Nobel laureate, he wrote about psychedelics as taking one beyond good and evil in Nietzschean sense. Again, that's another talk. But anyway, the ultimate point here is that if we consider certain psychedelic states as mystical states, and then we consider Spinoza's intellectual love of God as a mystical state, then of course it might be possible to jump over these religious practices of prayer and fasting and whatnot, and with a psychedelic go straight to that state, which then is at least akin to this 3rd kind of knowledge, this exposure to concrete reality, which is eternal. And we can understand it. I mean, if you just take it alone without any framework, of course, you're lost. You can't integrate it. But it integrates very nicely with Spinozism for reasons I've said. Also, other psychedelic experiences do, like as in panpsychism, this appreciation of nature generally, this notion that everything is nature, the absolute. So under Spinozism, then, we see that such psychedelic experiences are not necessarily delusional. They can actually be then veridical. They can express something which is real. But unfortunately, they are considered delusional still today in default academia science. But that's because pannihilism, then, is a product of the Cartesian split. Pannihilism leads to these paradoxes in mind and ecological disaster. The fact that it leads to paradoxes indicates that there's something seriously wrong with it. Taking the Spinozan path, I argue, would have curtailed the paradoxes and disasters. Moreover, the Spinozan path leads to the ultimate psychedelic unitive experience akin to the intellectual love of God as a veridical exposure to the fundamental Spinozan reality. God nature is all, as you. So, therefore, Spinozism now offers a fresh metaphysic that's inclusive of many psychedelic experiences, and which offers a rational modern path to mitigate our damage to nature. So what I'm advocating essentially is the understanding of certain psychedelic experiences through the Spinozan metaphysic, and this would lead ultimately, according at least to the Deep Ecology founder, to a greater respect for nature and a lessening of the fear of death. Thank you.
That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, Peter. I really, really enjoyed that. You tied that together beautifully. We've got quite a few questions in the chat. So what I'm going to do now is feel free to keep popping down any questions you've got in the chat, or if you're in the live stream at the moment, in the comments over there. And I'm going to unmute you one at a time, and then people can ask their questions. So Lloyd, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to unmute you now. And if you want to go ahead and ask your question directly.
Yeah, so I was saying, sorry, this is a stupid question, but how is Spinoza a determinist by laws of nature without being physicalist? Like, does he believe laws of nature extend to more than just the physical world? And if that is the case, what does that mean? Can we understand them?
Yeah, well, I prefer the word fatalist to determinist for that reason. But yeah, I mean, there is mental causation for him, but mental causation, like physical causation, is determined by previous causes. Now, but of course, because he's a monist, he doesn't think that mentality is determined by physical causes like the brain alone, but rather mental causes are determined by previous mental occasions. And these operate according to the fixed laws of nature, just as physical ones do, because they are one and the same. It's, you know, when we talk about the physical laws of nature, these are an abstraction. This is just the way of looking at the world in terms of extension or matter only. But for Spinoza, yeah, the laws of nature pertain to all attributes, not just physical matter, but mind as well. So there's no free will, although it's complicated because he says, you know, the purpose of life is to attain freedom from the bondage of the emotions. But ultimately, everything one does is determined by things of which we're unaware. Today, we talk about genetics, cultural inculcation, epigenetics, exogenetics, and so on. You know, we don't know why we get angry at certain things and not at other things. This is beyond our consciousness. So all of this is determined. So for Spinoza, yeah, there are laws. The laws of nature pertain to the mental as well as the physical, and that's why he's, you could call him a determinist, even though he's not a physicalist. Because again, remember, the physical and the mental are not in a hierarchical relationship. They are equal in terms of fundamentality.
Sure, thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Next, Aidan, you've got a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you had a response to the combination problem for panpsychism, because it seems that the theory is appealing because it solves a lot of the other problems that come about with other theories of mind, like, you know, the psychophysical law problem that you talked about for emergentism. So doesn't that kind of mean that it solves one problem, but then opens itself up to another?
Well, I will admit that every single position has got problems. The combination problem, for those of you who don't know, is one that's especially pertinent to panpsychism. It's got a history. William James was actually in 1890 one person who put it against panpsychism, even though William James later became a panpsychist in the pluralistic universe. Excuse me. But the combination problem is this: how do separate mentalities unite to form a greater mentality? How do they, like cells of my body, which all have a basic sentience, unite to create my overall sense of self, for example, or a particular color or whatever it may be? How does Spinoza respond to that? Well, number one, Spinoza, that's not on his radar. That's not an issue. And also, his panpsychism generally is more implied than explicit. But ultimately, now this, I don't want to get too deep, but for him then, extension is infinite. Every attribute is, there are an infinite number of attributes, and there's every attribute is infinite in itself as well. So extension or space is infinite. Thought is also infinite, therefore. And this he calls the infinite intellect. This is almost like the intellect of God, but that's not at all like a human intellect. It has no emotions or will or anything like this. But we, just as every physical thing is a part of a part, two words, of space, so every mind, every sentience is a part of the infinite intellect. So what you'd probably call in modern parlance cosmopsychism. And therefore, the combination problem is resolved from above rather than below, as it were. So if you look at sort of responses to the combination problem from a cosmopsychist point of view, you'll begin to understand how Spinozism can mitigate that. But I would say personally that a greater way of overcoming the combination problem is from a neo-Spinozist, Alfred North Whitehead, because at the fundamental, one thing that I think is weak on Spinoza is his notion of individuals. He talks about modes, but he doesn't talk about monads. Leibniz is better in this respect. Leibniz is another panpsychist, a different theory, but similar there. How do you differentiate individuals? Well, Leibniz has his theory of monads. Alfred North Whitehead takes that further. He opens the windows, as it were, the Whiteheads, and he talks about every actual entity as being a prehension of everything around it. And this is, from the very fundamental level, a way of overcoming the combination problem. How you combine Whitehead's monadology with Spinozism in terms of overcoming the combination problem is like an academic paper I don't want to bore people with at the moment. But it's a very good point you make. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you for that response. Next, we have a question from Kenneth. You're unmuted now.
Hi. You mentioned towards the end this love that one feels that it seems to be related to like a divine union with God. Does Spinoza think that this love is fundamental? And what are its attributes? Is it neither physical nor mental?
Yeah. So it's called the intellectual love of God, but God is without any emotions. So it's not love as we understand it, because it's a fusion with, it's more like love as in a bond, as a fusion with this infinite intellect. It's when us, the finite intellect, becomes one with this greater infinite intellect. So it's a feeling of the unity, that is the love. It's intellectual because it's part of the infinite intellect of God, or God nature. So it's not really emotional, though when one comes out of it, one feels excessive profundity, as I said. It's not really love as we understand it. It's not the right word, perhaps. Yeah, can you come back? There was a second part to your question I'm not quite answering. Can you remind me?
Yeah, I was wondering whether, like, what the attributes of the love are, whether it's physical or mental. I mean, you said it's an intellectual love of God.
Yeah, it's not physical or mental because of this. So remember that the physical and the mental, which very basically are the same as extension and thought, not quite the same. They are then abstractions. They're expressions of understanding reality. There are prosaic, normal access to reality. This intellectual love of God breaks through that abstraction to the concrete essence of eternity, God as eternity. That means it's not physical or mental. It's something beyond it. And that's why I said in a way that this profound state, in many ways, it can't even be called consciousness. It's rather a state of being rather than state of consciousness. Something so different. But nonetheless, I mean, this is part of the ineffability that William James talks about. You feel it in your body, as it were, and you sort of feel it afterwards in your mind, but it's beyond both. It's again like it's a fusion of, you transcend the human way of existing, you see, this way. And so it's extremely hard to put into words. But all I can say is at least this 5-MU experience is profound, absolutely profound, although one cannot make immediately heads or tails of it. One cannot cognize its importance somehow. And I think, like Spinozism is perhaps one way of doing that. I'll just add this as well. So Spinoza died in 1677. And Einstein sees him as the first sort of major modern philosopher, as do I. But he's not perfect. I mean, he does lack the theory of evolution. It's not incompatible with evolution at all, but it's just not in there. Whitehead sort of applies the theory of evolution to Spinozism in a certain way and moves it on a bit. But historically, the key figure is Spinoza, and that's why I spoke about it mostly. But yeah, the combination of Spinoza and Whitehead, I think it's more fruitful in many ways to modern discussions.
I'm really enjoying these questions. We've got one from YouTube, which I'd be really interested to hear answering as well. Are you aware, this is from Daniel, are you aware of any practical collaboration between Spinoza's deep ecologists working with conservationist biologists or ecologists?
I must admit that I'm coming to deep ecology fairly recently. I've always heard of Ness, but I haven't really read him. I'm reading his book of essays now and some online things. Carolyn Merchant, interesting. Carolyn Merchant, though, doesn't mention Spinoza or Whitehead. That's a real omission in her work, which is otherwise good, The Death of Nature. I'm not aware, actually, of people currently working on this, except for me. But I'm sure there are. No, that's not true. Beth Lord is a Spinozan scholar who's talking about Spinoza and ecology, actually, in a few days or next week or something. Beth Lord, yeah. So she's I haven't heard her talk yet, and I'm not sure. I don't think she's going to talk about the sort of Cartesian legacy as I did, and so on. But anyway, there's one person, Beth Lord, worth looking into. But I just say again, Arne Næss, he recommends Spinoza, but also Whitehead and Heidegger as philosophers for the deep ecology movement. So, I mean, I see it as a fruitful thing. It's the future, you know. It's a new way of looking upon reality, which is more parsimonious. It's not at all based on faith, well, it's not based on faith, belief, or anything. It's just another rational way of looking at the world, which has major implications about our approach to it.
Amazing. I'm going to jump on that actually and ask one of my own questions. I was going to save it to the end, but seeing as we're on this realm, so my background is geography, so that's my kind of disciplinary interest. And I'm interested, you mentioned it at the beginning and kind of throughout, speaking of this dualism between nature and culture. And I kind of have two questions in one. One, kind of if you could define that more exactly, whether, because I mean, in recent literature, for example, I think you might adopt more, and this might just then kind of ideas of like hybrid conceptualizations or maybe post-humanism, which would all be critiqued, but whether we're completely saying that humans and nature have never been separate, and therefore, when it comes to the kind of ecological crisis that we have, do you think there's any value in still maintaining a dualism in order to kind of induce a sense of human responsibility? Or is the only way forward to completely dismantle that dualism and just move forward that way?
What would be the value in maintaining the dualism, really? I mean, okay, I suppose that'd be, in terms of industry and so on, yeah, it'd be better. But ultimately, I think this dualism has led to this alienation of us from nature, mankind and nature. And I think religion, like I said, religions have caused this, especially Christianity, although there are a lot of ecological Christians out there, especially process theologians or Whiteheadians that I shouldn't ignore. And that's an interesting debate I'm beginning to have with some of them. But I think that if you consider nature as even, you know, in terms of rocks, you know, the autopoietic systems like molecules, not granite boulders, because they are not self-sufficient. So that's where the question of monads, you know, how you define an individual becomes important. But if you consider the fact that nature doesn't simply have an instrumental value, in other words, instrumental to us humans, but has its own intrinsic value, then I think that just conduces to a greater respect for it. And also, if you consider nature to be much more than the physical in terms of it being just one expression of what is also mental, but also having an infinity of other attributes, it just becomes a greater entity. It's not reduced away just to like its spatial dimensions to a series of meter. Eddington, you know, the great scientist, he was a panpsychist as well, and he said, you know, we shouldn't reduce everything we see to pointer readings. In other words, you know, temperature is just the pointer reading on a meter or whatever. You know, there's much more to everything than what we can read on a meter. Like, for example, even another human, you know, we can measure your height, weight, so on and so forth. We can look at every single neuron, axon, dendrite, and whatnot. But after all that, there's still a fundamental aspect of the human that survives, and that is your inner life, you know, your mentality, which is everything for you, the most important thing. So we just have to be aware that quantifying everything, this is what Thomas Kuhn was talking about, you know, like just quantifying everything in terms of corpuscular shape, size, motion, and so on, leaves out so much. And that's so much that you think, well, so what? You know, the important thing is, our relationship to our environment. It just completely changes that. You know, if you'd have a very different relationship to your partner if you suddenly realized they were a robot, you know, in other words, without any sentience. Same with nature. You know, we're basically looking at it from this Cartesian point of view as a big robot, big mechanism, big machine. But if we think of it as alive, it completely changes everything. And so this is, again, the point of deep ecology. It's not simply about creating new technologies or eating less meat or driving less and so on, you know. These are just surface phenomena. To really reinstate a respect for nature requires a greater metaphysic.
Amazing, thank you for that. I very much agree. Slightly playing devil's advocate, I really enjoy that. And next, you've got a question from Daniel. I'm going to unmute you now.
Hello, thank you, Peter, and our organizers. Well, if you allow, I have to say that I'm a big 5MEO enthusiast, and I'm lucky to be in a country, in Portugal, where it's not scheduled. So I've been, well, let's say, doing it for a few years and snorted the pure molecule, not the toad. And well, from that, I have ended up in analytical idealism. And for me, it's like panpsychism. From what I can hear, like Spinoza sounds more like an analytical idealist than a panpsychist.
Okay. Analytic idealism. What? Remind me. What is this?
Well,
I know. You know, Kant's idealism, Berkeley's, and so on, Schopenhauer's. But what is analytic idealism again?
Yeah, it goes a bit further from. I'm also like not conceptually that masterfully. I don't know, but it's like first of all, consciousness is fundamental, right? And whereas in panpsychism you have different entities, there is no separation. It's kind of like a down top approach to consciousness, that it emerges, like it still emerges. Whereas in analytical idealism, everything is mind. There is only mind, and there is like transcendental intersubjectivism.
Okay, I mean, yeah, that sounds, you know, like Kant's transcendental idealism. But I'll say this: that there were a number of idealist interpreters of Spinoza, especially in the 19th century. He was seen as an idealist for a while. But one must remember that for him, reducing everything to mind is simply to reduce everything to the one attribute, to the cost of all the other attributes. So again, I wouldn't call him an idealist, because he, as I said, he considers matter and mind to be equally fundamental. Of course, our interpretation of matter, our view of matter, is based on our subjectivity. So there is that. There's also another reason why I don't want to get too far into it, but some people argue that Spinoza does value mind a little bit over all the other attributes. There's an interesting, if you look at letter 66 from Spinoza, and also a passage in the short treatise, he says that every other attribute, other than thought and extension, has an associated mental understanding, right? Which means that every other attribute must be seen mentally in its different way. He's very ambiguous about this. It's quite interesting. But Spinoza is generally classified as either pantheist, monist, a neutral monist sometimes, you know, that God nature is neither mind nor matter, but something even more fundamental than both. And sometimes as a double aspect theorist. But, you know, you have to be careful. All these words, you know, they often overlap. Like Schopenhauer, he calls himself an idealist, but he was also a panpsychist in one sense, you know, that will was everywhere. So maybe analytic idealism is related to Spinozism. I don't know. I mean, but, you know, have a look at Spinozism in a bit more detail, and then compare it to your 5MEO experiences. I'd be, if you have any reports, please email them to me, peter@philosopher.eu.
Yeah.
I should just say, don't tell anyone. It's peter@philosopher.eu.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Keep it to yourself. Just say this as well. A lot of people think, oh, all these words, you know, so pretentious, these philosophers with all their isms, right? The reason for big words is to make small sentences. So that it often has, you know, a lot of purpose. But of course, if you've never heard of these words, they do become confusing. I apologize, but it's just the way of it.
I like that very much. Next, we have a question from Joshua. You're unmuted.
All right. Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. I appreciate it, and I really like all the work that you do. I've been following you for a while. I'm an anthropologist, and I've been trying to integrate a lot of Deleuze into my work, and Deleuze kind of has his book on Spinoza. And there's some people who study drugs who have incorporated Spinoza into their work, and there's one, Peta Malins in particular. She talks about psychedelic drug assemblages, but she uses MDMA as kind of her case example. And she kind of has the idea that when a body comes into contact with other bodies, according to Spinoza's view, those other bodies could either combine to increase kind of the life power or the life force of the body, or they could, which would equate to joy or joyous experience, according to Spinoza's terms, or they could decrease the life power of the body.
Right.
So that's kind of like one thing I've been thinking through. But I also, I keep up to date with at least some of the other philosophers who study psychedelics, like Thomas Metzinger and these guys, and they seem very reductionistic, even though they're long-term meditators, even though they've had a wide range of experiences with psychedelics, they still kind of go back to this neuroscientific distinction between an embodied self and a narrative self. And so I don't know, it's a crazy question, but like, how could we think of the self, in contrast to that panhilist position? Like, what is the self in a way, according to Spinoza, or according to your perspective, if that's even, I know you mentioned in the other question that the question about the individual is kind of left unpacked by Spinoza, but it's just something all these thoughts have been working through, if you could say anything.
Yeah, I mean, I'm working through those thoughts as well. So I say this, Deleuze has 2 books on Spinoza. Spinoza, Practical Philosophy, and Expressionism in Philosophy of Spinoza. And in the last section of that latter book, he talks about the intellectual love of God. He gives his interpretation of it. So it's worth looking at for a start. The first book, though, I found amazing. I mean, with my view on Deleuze is that what he writes about other philosophers like Deleuze, like Spinoza, Bergson, Nietzsche, absolutely brilliant. His own philosophy I don't like very much, though, when he goes it alone. Yeah, no, a lot to be taken out of Deleuze. He's more a philosopher than a scholar, of course, as you know. In terms of joy, for Spinoza, joy is ultimately the increase of power. And he's very much in line with Nietzsche there. That when one overcomes an obstacle, that's what joy is. Even if one is subconscious to a person. And sorrow is the lack of power, lack of, you said, life force, but essentially that's power for him. And this is one reason Spinoza got into trouble as well, because it ultimately does reduce emotions to power a lot. And as I said, it's sort of beyond good and evil, Spinoza and Nietzsche, and that's why they got on. And also Deleuze's interpretation of Spinoza is very Nietzschean, which is why I like it. And there's this very interesting question about good and evil in relation to God and in relation to psychedelics, and whether it leads to a greater good, or whether it transcends sociological good and evil dogmas of morality, and so it really depends what you mean by this, and so on and so forth. I mean, Spinoza says there's no such thing as good and evil, but at the same time he's talked about the highest good, so he means it in a different sense, as does Nietzsche. Fascinating questions. I mean, that I'm going to write an essay on psychedelics and nihilism at some point, regarding that. Also in relation to Bertrand Russell, like he said, one of the 4 main criteria for the mystical state is the unreality of good and evil, very much in line with Nietzsche, who Russell didn't like. Yeah, so a lot of too many questions for me to answer, but all very interesting areas for research. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Next, I have a question from Fran, who I think's changed their screen name to Annie. So I'm unmuting you now if this is the wrong person. Put in the chat.
Hi. I just a little while ago came across Spinoza's sort of philosophies on circles, or he based some theories around circles, but then I've since forgotten where I came across this. I was wondering if it is something that you've also come across, and if you recall, you'd be able to describe anything about it.
He does use a circle somewhere. Where was it now? To express intuitive knowledge. Where was it? I can't remember the reference now, but I don't think he dwells on it really. I mean, there's no philosophy of circles in Spinoza. As far as I remember, it's just used as an analogy to express a point. Is that right, Annie? You're muted.
Yeah, I think it was something.
No, I can't remember the reference, I'm afraid. Sorry, I wasn't expecting that question.
That's all right.
If I email me, and it might have come to my mind tomorrow or something.
Sure.
Brilliant. We'll just take a couple more if that's okay with you, Peter. We've got quite a few more.
Now it's coming to me now, actually. There's a circle and a little circle in it and a line between the two gaps, isn't there? Yeah. Okay. Tomorrow it will be there.
Good question. Next, we've got a question from Isaac. You're unmuted.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk and everyone for organizing this. My question was about like psychedelic focused neuroscientists. I'm thinking particularly of like Robin Carhart Harris. And it seems like just from reading some of his things that he would argue for as like a scientist, a Western scientist, he would argue for a more panhylist or physicalist interpretation that still is inclusive of these like very mystical states and all these like unitary experiences and all these like really amazing things. But he would argue, and I think a lot, there is still explanatory weight to that form of science that doesn't necessarily rely on the mind as whether it's an attribute, another attribute, or another substance.
You cut out a little bit there, so I might not have caught everything you said. But Robin Carhart Harris told me that he's a double aspect theorist, so he's not a physicalist. Although you would think so from the literature. That's what I mean. This is the standard. You know, it's like you write in a standard way, neuroscience, whatever. Every field's got their own little writing style, and the assumption is you get words like, you know, this generates this mental thing, or this makes emerge this, or this supervenes upon this. These little words like this generates this mental, this is the unknown, this gap, you know, this is the big explanatory gap. Carhart Harris, he though is not a physicalist. I know that. Okay. But there are others, of course, who are. And the question is, isn't there value in that? Now, of course, there's value. I mean, you know, neuroscience is, of course, fascinating science, and I'm not denigrating it in the slightest. But again, one always has to separate the science as a method from science, from an ideology. Science as an ideology. One's a method, which is perfectly legitimate, as it should be. But you know, but when you forget its method and you attribute a faith to it, an ideology like panpsychism, then you go wrong, and then you make judgments like, well, now this experience, then the psychedelic experience must be a delusion. Now, what causes this delusion? You know, so let's look at the brain scans and see what's correlated to it. I mean, the worst case of this is something called Persinger's helmet, which was a big thing about 20 years ago. I don't know if you heard of it, but Dr. Persinger made this helmet, and it sort of streamed magnetic rays into the brain or something like this. And then he said that this instigates a sense of God, and therefore the sense of God is false. You know, it's just simply brain waves or whatever. Well, I can't remember the details. But of course it doesn't at all. You know, one would expect, if God were real, or nature were real, or any metaphysical reality were real, if one perceived it, one would expect correlates in the brain and the body. Of course one would, just as one has correlates when one sees, you know, a real cup. That doesn't mean that the cup does not exist. And likewise, if one has correlates, like in 5-MeO or whatever, to something, that doesn't therefore, just because you can look at the physical correlates, doesn't therefore mean the object to which it is parallel is therefore delusional. Of course not. This is a sort of logical error. Neuroscience is very good for medicine, you know, like anesthetics, general anesthetics work. They're very useful, but people don't know why they work. But it doesn't matter. As long as it does work, there is medical instrumental value. So looking at psychedelics in terms of how consciousness is related to the brain and body, of course, that's interesting. If people are, you know, if of course there are hallucinations, if people are hallucinating and they don't want to, then understanding certain mechanism, you might be able to switch off certain mechanisms which occasion it. But of course, doesn't answer any ultimate metaphysical questions about it, you know. And as I say, the big falsifier of panpsychism as a general, it's also a metaphysic, of course, is this explanatory gap. It just doesn't go anywhere. But nonetheless,
thank you.
But nonetheless, it's useful. You know, it's useful for medicine, but it's not useful for understanding reality ultimately. And to be honest, I'll say one more thing. A lot of scientists would not dispute this. You know, a lot of scientists just, you know, they do their job, they do their method, they get paid for that funding. That's fine. But slowly, like Carolyn Merchant says, it's taught in schools as if it's absolute truth. And so understanding the historical origins of that, I think, helps emancipate people from it.
Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. I think we better leave the questions there. I'm sorry to everyone who didn't get their question asked. Peter, I don't know, it might be okay if you emailed him potentially.
I've got a few more minutes if you want. I said 7:30, but...
Okay, amazing. Well, then we'll do another one. Dylan, if you want to ask your question. You should be unmuted now.
Hi, yeah, this was just about how it seemed you were sort of seeing the mystical as just being a subset of the psychedelic when it came to experiences, and you were speaking how DMT would be a way of sort of quickly bypassing a lot of the lengthy like religious practices. I mean, it made me think of a story that Terence McKenna claims he managed to convince a lama to smoke DMT, and he said, these are the lesser lights. If you want to go any further than this, you need to die. Or that, no, you can't go any further without dying. I wondered if you thought you were missing out on anything by restricting your scope to DMT.
I'm not aiming on trying death in the soon, but interestingly, Ernst Junger, who coined the term psychonaut, he also spoke with Albert Hoffman when they took LSD and mescaline and so on together, psilocybin together. Junger said the same thing, in the earlier than McKenna, I think. He said, yeah, and the final step, of course, is death. And for Spinoza as well, death, like the whole point of this, well, the ethical consequence, not the point of this, is to assuage the fear of death, that one has tasted death by becoming one with God nature. This is because it is eternal. So, and of course, this was also the point a number of people argue with the Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece. Everyone would have these experiences, and the outcome would be to lessen the fear of death. So, yeah, one will never know in this lifetime, by definition, I'm afraid.
Brilliant. We've got a comment on the YouTube live stream, which I think is talking to the question on circles, that's given a quote in terms of geometry never quitting the sphere of its first assumption, which was found in Spinoza's Life and Works Fortnightly Review, 1843, I think page 214, if you want to check that. That might help answer the question. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending and your questions. Apologies we didn't quite get through all of them. Thank you so much for that, Peter. I really, really enjoyed that. That was really interesting. And thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Amazing. I'll hopefully see you at our next event. Thank you for attending and enjoy the rest of your evenings very, very much.
Amazing.